Yeah.
Sir, would you be uploading questions for the cases in biology, like the previous grade on McGraw-Hill? Because the previous professor, I don't think she uploaded them for the specific cases yet. She's uploaded it for the chapters, but not for the cases. Will you be doing that?
Yeah. The questions in McGraw-Hill are an aid for you to see if you understand topics of the chapter, but I don't have any questions for the green biotechnology chapter. But I will have some questions to fall everywhere during the lecture. But it's not in the McGraw-Hill platform, so we can have a database with different questions, and these chapters are specific to this course, so it's not part of the database.
We had like lectures where like basically they were 2 hours, so like we had like basically a 5-minute break.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that. 2 hours is a long period of time for you as well as for me. So it would be very convenient if we have a small break in between. I will see how we can, when we will organize these breaks, but usually it's after 1 hour. And it's usually a 7-minute break, not a 5-minute break. Okay? So then back to the outline of the chapter. Structure of proteins is very important. Why? I will show you in a minute that proteins can have a very wide range of different functions. And the function of a protein is closely related to the structure of the protein. So this also means that if the structure of the protein is removed or destroyed, then usually the protein is not active anymore. It doesn't have a suitable function anymore. So therefore, it's important to discuss the protein structure and how these proteins are folded to result in a specific 3D structure. So folding is one aspect. The opposite is denaturation. Denaturation, we remove the 3D structure from the protein, but that will be discussed in more detail later on. And then at the end of the chapter, I will give you some examples and applications of how proteins are important in our daily life, but also in industry, and maybe also in your future professional career. So let's start with the introduction, brief introduction. So proteins, what are proteins? So, I'm also aware of the fact that a lot of you already are familiar with the concept of these biomolecules, but probably also a lot of other students are not familiar with these biomolecules. For that reason, we try to get everyone at the same level, and maybe we have to repeat something that you already know. So that being said, proteins, they are important in our diet, so they're an important nutrient source. Where can we find proteins? Typically in fish and meat, but also in plant-based products. We'll come back to that later on. What are proteins? Proteins are biomolecules composed of building blocks. These building blocks are called alpha amino acids. So which are the building blocks? You can see here the general structure of an alpha amino acid, which typically consists of an amino group, an acid group, hence the name amino acid. We have here a hydrogen, and then we have an R group. The R group can be different for different amino acids. The R group also gives certain properties to a specific amino acid. But the basic structure is shown here. These building blocks are coupled to each other by formation of peptide bonds to form a long linear polymer. A long linear biopolymer consisting of all these building blocks that are coupled to each other. However, this long stretch of amino acids can have quite complex 3D structures. At the right-hand side, you see different examples of how this long protein chain can be folded in specific 3D structures. And as I mentioned already, structure is quite closely related to the function. So if you have a lot of different 3D structures, we can also assume that these proteins also carry out different functions. That's what the next slide is all about. So these proteins show a wide variety of structure, but also of function. I will give you a few examples of to demonstrate or to illustrate the wide range of different functions proteins can carry out. So some proteins have a structural function. Structural function means that they contribute to the structure, maybe of a tissue, such as cartilage, and that's protein based, and that contributes to the structure of your tissues. Nails, for instance, it's quite hard structure. These are keratin proteins. These are specific proteins that give this hard shell on the top of our fingers to protect the fingers. So that's a function that contributes to structure in a certain tissue. However, you can also look at proteins that contribute to the structure at cellular level. For instance, if you take a look at the cell wall of bacterial cells or other cells, also there proteins are an important component of these cell walls. So also at cellular level, at microscopic level, these proteins can have a function to contribute to structure. Here you see a silkworm that's making silk. Silk is also a certain structure, and that's also a certain protein that is formed. Second type of function is transport. So proteins can carry out a transport function, and here also an important example is the example of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is shown here. It's actually 4 subunits that are associated together, and hemoglobin is a protein that's responsible for transporting oxygen that's taken up in the lungs and transported through the tissues where the oxygen is needed for the metabolic processes. So that's also at a macro scale, let's say, that hemoglobin transports oxygen from lungs to other tissues. However, proteins are also involved in transport at micro scale, meaning that transport systems to import or export molecules inside and outside the cell. These transport systems are also usually made up by different proteins. I think import-export from cells, cellular transport, that is discussed by Inge, I think, and so there she discussed different transport types. So, transport of molecules, then immune response, very important one, of course. The antibodies we produce when we are confronted with a certain pathogenic organism, these antibodies are also typically proteins, or also sometimes called polypeptides. These are quite complex molecules, very large molecules. I will go a bit more into detail in the application part of this chapter. But indeed, antibodies are also very important in the immune response. Movement, muscle contraction, for instance, that involves the function of certain proteins, active myosin proteins that are responsible for muscle movement. Also here at microscopical scale, when you look at the movement of bacterial cells, and they make use of flagella, these flagella are also constituted of a number of proteins. So also here again, macro scale and micro scale. Other are possible functions, blood clotting, but also enzymes. Enzymes are a very important type of protein because they have industrial application potential. I will give you some examples at the end of the chapter as well, but remember that enzymes are a very important type of proteins for different applications. Okay, that being said, it was the introduction to give you already an idea of what a protein is. Next, we switch to the building blocks of these proteins to see how these proteins are built up and how they can form a certain structure and also a certain function. So these building blocks are called alpha amino acids. Here again, you can see the general structure of an alpha amino acid. And why is it an alpha amino acid? I think in the first semester you got chemistry, where you got familiar with the UPAC nomenclature, I think, right? there, if we have to indicate at which carbon a certain functional group is planted, there we make use of numbers. In biochemistry, we want to usually do it a little bit different. And here we start the numbering from the first carbon after the carboxyl group. So this is the C alpha. If there are more carbons, then we have the C beta, the C delta, and so on. In UPAC nomenclature, this would be the C1, this would be the C2. Okay, so it's slightly different, but the concept is quite similar. So if you take a look at this general structure of the amino acids, we have this amino group. The amino group is coupled to the C alpha. Also here we have the carboxyl group, so hence alpha amino acid. Here again, this R group, the R group can be different for different proteins, and depending on the R group, we can have amino acids with different properties. Already said. What's also important about this amino acid, if you take a look at the C alpha carbon, that is a chiral carbon. Do you remember what a chiral carbon is in stereochemistry? Yeah. Yeah. A carbon that is bound with 4 different groups, and the result of that is that we can draw 2 different molecules that are resembling each other quite well. However, they differ in the orientation of 2 different groups in this tetrahedral configuration. So also here, this is a chiral molecule. So we have 2 different molecules that we can have here. However, if the orientation is different, also the properties can be slightly different. And for that reason, if it's different molecules, we also need different names. And that's why we use the L and D assignment. L and D to assign 2 different enantiomers. So enantiomers are molecules that are a mirror image of each other, but are not exactly the same. And that is discussed in stereochemistry as well. So here again, we also have these L and D form. In the UPAC nomenclature, it's referred to R and S. Okay, this is also here an example of 2 enantiomers of an alpha amino acid. In this case, it's alanine. Here we have the L form, the L enantiomer. Here on this side, you have the D enantiomer. This the same was also covered when Inge was talking about the carbohydrates, I think. There you also have these stereochemical aspects. So for that reason, I also added L-glyceraldehyde as D-glyceraldehyde in this slide. Okay, if we have a closer look at the function and the properties of these amino acids, if you have a closer look, then this acid group, this carboxylic acid group, what does it do? It's typical for an organic acid. And an organic acid, basically this form, what does it do? It's a weak acid that can be dissociated in neutral pH. Dissociated, it means that the proton is removed and we can transfer it to water. So this is the equilibrium reaction that occurs. In physiological pH or neutral pH, this equilibrium will be shifted to the right. The L and the D actually refers to, it's a bit complex here, but I think Inge also mentioned it in stereochemistry of carbohydrates. When the heteroatom at the last chiral carbon is on the right-hand side, in the Fischer reaction we have the D. If the heteroatom is on the left-hand side, we have L. If we here look at the Fischer reaction, this is not really the Fischer reaction, but it's easy to think of the Fischer reaction based on this figure. This is the only chiral carbon, so also the last one. Here the heteroatom is at the left-hand side, so in this case it's an L. Clear? So, amino acids, so the first thing we have to talk about is this acid group. The acid can be dissociated in neutral pH. On the other hand, we also have this amino group. And organic bases are typically of this structure. RNH2. This is a weak base, so it means it can take up protons. It can take up protons, and again, in neutral pH, this equilibrium will be shifted to the right. This has some implications if we have a look at the charges of an amino acid. And here you can see the general structure of an amino acid in different forms, different ionic forms. In very low pH, we will see that also the carboxylic acid group is protonated. So in a very low pH, this equilibrium will be shifted to the left, totally to the left. So this acid group is protonated. Also the amino group is protonated. So we have here a positive charge, and the net charge of this molecule is +1. If we then increase the pH, then at a certain pH, this acid group will be dissociated. And then we are in this form. In this form, where the acid group is dissociated, giving rise to a negative charge, the positive charge of the amino group, it remains. So this means that in this molecule, the net charge is 0. It does not mean that this molecule doesn't have any charges. The net charge is 0, but there are charges. More in particular, the plus charge on the amino group and the negative charge on the acid group. Okay, so if we gradually decrease the pH, at a certain moment, we have an equal amount of this cation form and this Zwitter ion form. The Zwitter ion form is the form in which the net charge is 0. That's the definition of the Zwitter ion. So at a certain pH, you have a perfect equilibrium between these two, and at this point, the pH will be equal to the pK1 constant. Okay? If we then keep on increasing the pH, then at a certain point also the amino group will be deprotonated, giving rise to this form. And if you again look at its charges, here we have a molecule that has a net charge of -1. Again here, a perfect equilibrium between these two, so equal amounts between these two forms when the pH equals the pK2. So that basically means that an amino acid has charges, and the net charge depends on the pH the amino acid is in. If we have a look at neutral pH, so a pH of around 7, which is common in our body, then we have a predominance of this form, the Zwitter ion form. So in most cases, we deal with the Zwitter ion forms, except for some amino acids that have an additional charge, positive or negative, that is comprised in the OR group. I will give you some examples of that later on. Is this clear so far? Any questions? Okay, so, yeah.
So the other group, we put the pH.
Yeah. A very good question, and I've already anticipated on that question in the next slide. So, remember that proteins are composed of these different building blocks, different amino acids. I think everyone is familiar with Lego. Lego, also the little building blocks. With Lego, we have a huge amount of building blocks. For proteins, you have only 20 building blocks. 20 different building blocks, but it's still sufficient to have a wide variation of different structures. And these 20 amino acids are called proteinogenic amino acids because these are the amino acids that can be built in a protein chain. And first of all, we're going to cover these 20 amino acids, but also classifying them in specific functional groups. And the functional groups are nearly based on the properties of the R group, because the rest is the same. If you take a look at the general structure of an amino acid, only the R group is different if we compare different amino acids with each other. So in this case, the R group is very important to establish certain properties of a specific amino acid. And why is this R group so important? Because the R group also depends whether or not an amino acid can form interactions with other molecules or other amino acids. I'll give you some explanations later on. The first group of amino acids, they have a hydrophobic R group, a hydrophobic R chain. And these amino acids are presented here. So in green, every time the R group is indicated, and you can see that these amino acids either have an alkyl chain, such as alanine, valine, leucine. Isoleucine is not mentioned here, but that's also an amino acid in this group. Or they have an aromatic group, like tryptophan or phenylalanine. And in this case, this is a special amino acid because here the R group is actually involved in a cyclic side chain. That's an amino acid protein. So if you have a look at these R groups, then it's clearly the case that these are all hydrophobic R groups. So they don't interact with water or they don't like water molecules in their neighborhood. Okay, what was your question again?
How does the R group influence pH?
Yeah. No, the R group doesn't influence the pH. The pH influences the charge of the R group.
Yes.
Yeah. So, second group of amino acids are the hydrophilic R groups. Amino acids with hydrophilic R groups. So there are some amino acids presented here. So these are R groups that contain either an oxygen or a sulfur in their side chain. And this causes a polar moment or a dipole moment in this amino acid side chain. So due to the presence of oxygen here, there, or sulfur, we have a polar R group. A polar R group means that this R group, this R side chain of these amino acids, that these R groups also like to interact with water molecules, or they like to interact with other polar side chains or polar molecules in general. Then we have the amino acids with positively charged R groups, and then I'm coming to your question maybe a bit more in detail. So here again you have the general structure. The R group is indicated here, but for this case, in the case of lysine, you have an additional amino group at the end of the side chain. This additional amino group will also be protonated in physiological pH. So this means that lysine has 3 charges in neutral pH, being a negative charge at the carboxylic acid group, a positive charge at the alpha amino group, and also a positive charge in the side chain. This means that lysine in a neutral pH has a net charge of +1. Okay. The same holds true for these other amino acids. Also here, there are some amino groups in the side chain that can be protonated in neutral pH. So these 3 amino acids have a net positive charge in neutral pH. Net positive charge means that it likes to interact with negatively charged other molecules. Okay. And then we also have the counterpart, the amino acids with a negative charge in the side chain. And these are indicated here. There are 2, aspartate and glutamate. And what you see here in the side chain, there's an additional carboxylic acid group. And again, carboxylic acid groups are deprotonated in neutral pH. So it means that an additional negative charge will appear in the side chain of aspartate and glutamate. Okay? I have a lot of structures that are shown here. I don't expect that you know for each amino acid what the structure is or vice versa. So I will not ask you, okay, what amino acid is this? Then I don't expect that you say it's glutamate or for another one, tryptophan or phenylalanine or whatever. But if I show you such a molecule, then you have to be able to say it's an amino acid. So you have to recognize it as an amino acid. And you have to be able to mention several interesting properties of this amino acid, being a story about the charges, a negative and positive charge. Maybe this is just ion. Maybe this is a negative net charge in neutral pH, and so on and so on. What else? Other properties. It's an alpha amino acid. It has some enantiomers, or most of them at least. So these are the things that I expect. So I don't expect you to remember all these amino acids. That's the most important one because the hydrophilic or hydrophobic property defines with which other molecules it can interact. And this interaction, as we will see in the protein structure, is very important. Okay, so these are the acid amino groups. The acid amino groups have a negative charge in the side chain in neutral pH. The other ones are called basic amino acids. They have a net positive charge. If you have a look at the acidic amino acids, aspartate and glutamate, they also have two amide derivatives thereof. So asparagine is an amide derivative of aspartate, while glutamine is an amide derivative of glutamate. If we have a look at these amino acids, they have a neutral charge they have no net charge in neutral pH, but they are polar molecules for sure. These structures induce a very strong dipole moment, so these are polar side chains. No, in a similar way, you have different charges. So, for instance, here we have a net negative charge in neutral pH. If you decrease the pH, then at some point, this carboxylic acid will be protonated, and then you have a net charge of 0. If you then go even lower, then you have this one that's also protonated, and then you have a +1. So for these, with the regular ones, you have the possibilities of -1, 0, +1. Here you can have the -1. You have also -2. With a very high pH, this is also deprotonated. So in this case, you have the possibility of -2 at very high pH, then it goes to -1, 0, and +1. For the basic amino acids, it's vice versa. So at a very low pH, here, lysine will have a net charge of +2, because this acidic group will also be protonated. In this case, you go from +2, and with increasing pH, +1, 0, -1. Okay. So this is an overview of optics. Can you on top please be a bit more quiet, because I cannot hear the questions. So please be a bit more quiet. Yeah, it's an anion. Anion means that it has a negative charge. A charge means very, very hydrophilic. A water molecule is a very polar molecule, so it likes to interact with other polar molecules or charges. It's an interaction that's based on electrostatic attraction. So this is the overview of the 20 proteinogenic amino acids. What I didn't specify yet is that the proteins that are built in a protein structure are all L amino acids and not D amino acids, except for glycine, but I will come back to that later on. Here we have the names of the amino acids, and these are abbreviated either with a 3-letter code, which is quite logical, but also with a one-letter code. Also here, I don't expect you to know all these abbreviations, but if you see some kind of a amino acid sequence, that's usually mentioned in a one-letter abbreviation, and then at least you know that each letter corresponds to a specific amino acid in that chain. Okay, then maybe it's time to have some recap questions about these amino acids. So I would like to ask you to log into the poll everywhere, and we have here 4 amino acids that are shown, and a couple of questions will follow about these amino acids. Which is the most hydrophobic one, which is the most hydrophilic one, and which amino acids are chiral molecules. Did you manage to log in? No problems. Okay, I think the majority has voted. Who indicated that glutamate is the most hydrophobic one? No one. Who indicated that glycine is the most hydrophobic one, and why?
Well, I'm not sure because of the charges, but it looks to me like a monopolar molecule.
Yeah. Indeed, it's maybe the hardest one to assess the polarity or the hydrophobicity. But if you take a look at glutamate here, glutamate has a negative charge. Negative charge or a positive charge means that it very likely wants to interact with water molecules. So if there is a charge, it's very hydrophilic. Next thing is that you have to look at polar groups. Polar groups also like to interact with water molecules, so also hydrophilic. And then the next step is hydrophobic R chains. They don't like to interact with water molecules. So these alkyl chains and these aromatic groups, they usually don't like to interact with water molecules. So in this case, indeed, leucine is the most hydrophobic one. Glycine, it's a bit, you have the apolar, you have the polar, and glycine is a bit in between. And then of course you have the charge. Is that clear for everyone? Then we can go to the next one, which is the most hydrophilic one. That shouldn't be too hard now. More hydrophilic.
Yeah, like glutamate.
Because it has a charge. It has a real charge. The others, if you take a look at electrostatic interactions, I'm trying to explain a question here. So if you take a look at Coulomb interaction, that's the electrostatic force, and it's basically a constant multiplied by Q1, Q2, and here we have a real charge. The other doesn't have a real charge. It has a equal moment. So yeah, maybe so maybe here first glutamate is indeed the right question. That's the most hydrophilic one because it has a net negative charge here, so very likely to interact with water molecules. For the other one, leucine, that has an alkyl chain. This alkyl chain doesn't show any polarity. So molecules that are apolar are typically not willing to react with water molecules, because these water molecules are also polar molecules. So they don't want to interact with water molecules. For that reason, it's called hydrophobic. It's afraid of water. Is that an answer to your question? No, but it's a good question. Here, serine, for instance, so the question was, it's also hydrophobic, but it's not the case, because if you compare it with, when here was a CH3 group, then it is a hydrophobic side chain. However, this oxygen, it has a very high electronegativity value, so it pulls electrons to its side from carbon. So it means that they have a partial negative charge here and a partial positive charge here. And that creates this dipole moment. Yeah? Glycine is in between. It's not polar and not apolar. So hydrogen is, this is considered as a polar molecule or a polar side chain. But it's more that you have to compare them with each other. You have to put some value on it. Okay?
Change charge by the
Yeah. That's a good question. Indeed, when we change pH, we can change the properties of this amino acids. For instance, here, glutamate, that is a negative charge in neutral pH. If we decrease the pH, this will be protonated at this site. However, it will still be a polar side chain. Why? Because of the presence of these oxygens. It will also attract these electrons from the carbon here. So it will not have this negative charge, but it will still be polar. So it will still interact with water, but to a lesser extent. The electrostatic force will decrease. Is that a question? An answer to your question? Okay, then the last question here. Which of these amino acids has a chiral center? So again, chiral carbon means that you have a carbon which is bound to 4 different groups. If you take a look at these amino acids, here we have a carboxylic acid group, amino group, hydrogen, and the R group here. So 4 different groups, so indeed a chiral molecule, a chiral carbon here at the same time. Take a look at this one, similar, the R group is different, so indeed a chiral molecule. However, if you take a look at glycine, glycine here, it doesn't have 4 different groups. So this means this is not a chiral carbon, and not a molecule that has another enantiomer here. So that's the only exception. This is slightly hydrophilic. Yeah, because it's a very small molecule, and we also have these elements, oxygen as well as nitrogen, that also are pulling strings. Okay, amino acids, we have looked at the structure and then some properties. However, in our daily life, amino acids are very important in nutrition as well. So it's an important source of carbon, but more importantly, of nitrogen and of sulfur. When we look at cysteine and methionine amino acids, for instance. So in our body, we can make a lot of amino acids ourselves. However, there are also amino acids that we cannot make ourselves, and we are obligated to take them up through our food, through our daily food, through the diet. And if you take a look at the list of essential amino acids, because these are called essential amino acids that we cannot synthesize ourselves, but we have to take it through the food, then usually we see a list of around 8 amino acids. In some cases, we have some reports that say 9, so it's a bit complex. So therefore, it's also not important to memorize this list. However, it's important to know what an essential amino acid is and what this means. So, where is it important? For vegetarian people, it's important because they have to replace meat and fish by alternative protein sources. Meat and fish typically contain all amino acids that we have to take up. So they have a good proportion of all essential amino acids. However, if we replace them, for instance, by grains or by beans, which are also typically protein-rich food products, then we can see that grains, for instance, have a selection of these essential amino acids, but they lack tryptophan and lysine, for instance. If we take, on the other hand, beans, for instance, they also have a good mixture of essential amino acids, but they lack methionine. So that clearly indicates that for vegetarians, it's very important to have a good mixture of different alternatives for fish and meat. Okay, so we discussed the proteinogenic amino acids, these 20 different building blocks that can be used for making proteins. But there are also several other amino acids that are not built in proteins, but they still have an important biological function. I want to give you some examples. One example is tyrosine. And tyrosine is a hormone that's produced in the thyroid gland. The structure is indicated here. So if you take a look at the structure, it's indeed an alpha amino acid. Here we have the acid, here you have the C-alpha. For that reason, alpha amino acid. This is also an L-alpha amino acid. It's also a chiral molecule. And this is the side chain. It's a very complex side chain, but this amino acid is not built in proteins, but it has a function as a hormone. So in this case, for instance, a shortage of tyrosine in our body can reduce our metabolic speed and our metabolic rate. So people that have a thyroid gland that is not working sufficiently to produce a sufficient level of tyrosine hormone, these people are typically quite tired, have low energy, and also have a tendency to build up fat. So this is a nice example of an amino acid that is important, but it's not a proteinogenic amino acid. Second one is GABA. GABA, it's a gamma amino acid, and more specifically a gamma amino butyric acid. So here we have butyric acid. This is the carboxylic acid group. This is the C-alpha, C-beta, and the C-gamma. Again, for that reason, it's a gamma amino acid, and more specifically, gamma amino butyric acid. And this molecule is very important in signal the nervous system to actually inhibit signal transfer from one nervous cell to the other nervous cell, and it's GABA. So also not incorporated in proteins, but it does have an important biological function. And then we have beta-alanine. Beta-alanine can also have some different structures. Here again we have L-alpha-alanine. This is the proteinogenic amino acid. This is one of the 20 building blocks. But here you have the alternative, the beta-alanine. And here you see that the amino group is put on the C-alpha. Here the amino group is put on the C-beta. For that reason, beta-alanine. If you take a look at the names, L-alpha-alanine and beta-alanine, is this an L or a D beta-alanine, do you think? L? Why? Yeah, but here you have to take into account that D and L only refers to chiral molecules. Is this a chiral molecule? We'll have a look. Here, this C has 2 hydrogens, so no 4 different groups. Also this C has 2 hydrogens, so no 4 different groups. So this doesn't have any enantiomer. So it's not D or L, that's not necessary here, because there is no enantiomer for this molecule. Okay. Now maybe a few minutes more. So these building blocks are coupled to each other by formation of peptide bonds. Peptide bonds are reactions by the carboxylic group of one amino acid with the amino group of the next amino acid. And you can see here with this reaction that a water molecule is spliced out, and that here you have this peptide bond. And this is a covalent link between this C of the previous amino acid and this nitrogen from the next amino acid. What you also see in this peptide bond is that the original charges that they disappeared. So in the peptide bond, there are no charges anymore. What is left regarding the charges? That's a charge at this side of the peptide and a charge at this side of the peptide. And here you can also see that there is a clear orientation. If we couple amino acids with the carboxylic acid group of one and the amino group of the other, each time we have a certain orientation. And in this case, for proteins, we usually or always read the orientation from the N-terminal part to the C-terminal part. So this is the N-terminus, this is the C-terminus. The N-terminus always has a positive charge in a neutral pH. The C-terminal end always has a negative charge at the neutral pH. So depending on how many building blocks we use, we can call them oligopeptides. Oligopeptides is used for peptide chains consisting of a few amino acids, usually less than 20. So oligo means few. If we have more, then we talk about polypeptides, and if we have more than 50 amino acids, then we call them proteins. Also here, it's a rule of thumb. In other sources, you will see slightly different numbers, but just to give you an idea what these terms mean. Oligopeptides, it's a few. If we only have 2 amino acids, it's a dipeptide. If we have 3 amino acids, it's a tripeptide, tetrapeptide, pentapeptide, and so on. But generally referred to as oligopeptide. Here you have an example of a certain dipeptide where an alanine is coupled to a glycine. In this case, also the order of these amino acids is important. Here we have alanyl glycine. If you would change the order and you have at the N-terminal end the glycine that is then coupled to an alanine, then we would have glycyl alanine. It looks the same, but the properties of these dipeptides is different. So the order of the amino acids is also very important. Again, charges at the end remain, and we have this C-terminal orientation. This is an example of a tripeptide. Here we have an alanine, a glycine, and a valine. Again, N-terminal to C-terminal end. And indeed, the peptide bonds will remove the charges of the individual amino acids. This may be a good time to have a short break. Let's say a 7-minute break. So it means that we start at 10 past 12.
everything. I always have to do a press reset button that fails them when I can. Yeah, like I just want to be able to undo things in real life. So that's like a reset.
I know it's all because of my first exam,
My back is like vertical equation.
Yeah, where are you? Are you outside?
Because I look for like this, I found like little juice, but the little juice doesn't have this. So I found orange juice has some. So like, not like orange juice is never fancy flavor. Not really.
Like,
we can start.
How is that gonna work?
Okay. AZ stands for aminosyre, that's wrongly translated, so it's amino acid. So if there is an abbreviation of AA, that's amino acids, obviously. I think in one slide it's AZ, here for instance, it's also amino acid. If you have a peptide chain of lower than 20 amino acids, we call it an oligopeptide. Okay. So how can we synthesize these peptides? So first of all, we can have a look at the chemical synthesis of these peptides. So a chemical way of coupling all these amino acids to each other. However, I mentioned in the peptides that the orientation is important and also that the order of the amino acids is also very important. However, if we want to, for instance, make alanine glycine, so we want to make this one, and we have to mix alanine and glycine, and we have to hope that this carboxylic group will react with this amino group to result in this molecule, alanine glycine. However, also this carboxylic group could react with this amino group, giving you glycyl alanine. Next, also one molecule of glycine can react with its carboxylic acid with another molecule of glycine with the amino group. So in chemical synthesis, if you just mix the amino acids together, you don't have any control over which group will react with which group. So you don't have any control over which amino acid will be coupled with the other amino acid. To avoid that, there is a strategy that we could use by making use of blocking groups. And blocking groups are actually molecules that first we let them react with a certain reactive group of the amino acid that we want to exclude for further reaction. And so, for instance, here we have alanine. We want to couple alanine with its carboxylic group with the amino group of glycine. This means that we have to exclude this reactive amino group for further reaction. So that this alanine can only react with its carboxylic acid group. And we can do that, for instance, by making use of chloric acids, for instance. That's not too important, but here you can see that this amino group is acylated. It's acylated, and this means that after this reaction, we have put this blocking group on the amino group of alanine, and this amino group cannot participate in further chemical reactions. We have to do the same with glycine, but here it's the other way around. Here we don't want the carboxylic acid group to react, and we do want the amino group to react. So it means that we have to protect the carboxylic acid group from further reaction. And this can be done in this case by, for instance, treatment with methanol. So we have a methyl ester that is formed here. If we then mix both amino acids that are protected or have these blocking groups, then the only way they can react is by reaction of alanine with this carboxylic group of alanine with this amino group of glycine. And then we do have the wanted order. And we have alanine, first amino acid, and glycine, the second amino acid. After reaction, of course, we still have to remove the blocking groups, also by a certain chemical procedure, and then we have the desired dipeptide. Dipeptide consisting of alanine and glycine and in the correct order. Of course, that's a lot of additional effort we have to do. We have to apply several different chemical reactions before we can have the end product. However, it is feasible. So this is how peptide synthesis occurs in a chemical way. However, peptides are also, of course, synthesized in biological systems. And there we make use of biosynthesis of peptides, in which ribosomes play an important role. The exact mechanisms of how ribosomes connect the different amino acids to each other, we will discuss it in more detail in the next chapter. But here, remember that these ribosomes, they have some cavities which can be bound by the different amino acids. And the order of the amino acids, it's stored in the nucleic acid, which is here the messenger RNA or the mRNA. So what's the most important thing here, because I will go more in detail in the next chapter, that the amino acids that have to form the peptide bond, so this amino acid should react with the carboxylic group with this amino acid and its amino group. The specificity of this reaction is guaranteed by this ribosome, because the ribosome binds these amino acids in such a way that the carboxylic acid group of one amino acid is next to the amino group of the other amino acid. So then, just by binding these amino acids in a certain position, we only allow one specific reaction, and we don't allow reaction of the amino group of the other amino acid, for instance.
What exactly is the peptide? Like, what's the, how does it differ from another reaction?
What is a peptide?
Yeah, what exactly is peptide? We're talking about peptide.
Peptide is a combination in which amino acids are coupled. So a dipeptide is a molecule consisting of two amino acids that are coupled with a peptide bond.
Okay, so it may, like, the peptide bond is defined through the amino acid that comes bonding with that, or we have a peptide.
Maybe I can discuss it after the lecture, because I think most of the things I already mentioned, but I will explain again after the lecture. Okay? But a peptide is basically two amino acids, or three amino acids, four amino acids that are coupled through these peptide bonds. So a chain of amino acids is called a peptide. That's basically it. Okay.
Amino acids be bonded in other ways other than peptide bond?
They can form reactions with other molecules, for sure.
So with each other, is the only peptides?
With each other. There are some ways, for instance, that the carboxylic group of the side chain of glutamate, for instance, can also react with the amino group of the side chain of lysine, for instance.
Those are just exceptions.
Usually amino acids are coupled with each other with peptides. Okay, then I already emphasized that structure is important for these proteins. So let's have a look at the structure of proteins, and there we can distinguish different levels of structure. The primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structure. If we talk about the primary structure of proteins, then we just talk about the linear order of the different amino acids. So how these amino acids are coupled to each other. The linear order. In all these levels of structure, it's important that you know what it is and that you know which interactions, which bonds are responsible for this level of structure. For the primary structure, it's basically the peptide bond. It's logical because the peptide bond couples all amino acids to each other. If you take a closer look at this peptide bond, so this is the carboxylic acid carbon of this amino acid, this is the amino group of the next amino acid, so this is the peptide bond that couples both amino acids to each other. If we take a look at this, then we can write this resonance form. So this means that this double bond is actually distributed over this axis of oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen. So this is also exemplified here, where you have this p orbital, which is distributed over these three atoms. So this means that this has a partial double bond character, this peptide bond. And partial double bond character means that we're talking about sp2 hybridizations. I hope that rings bells still from first semester. But sp2 hybridizations are characterized by bonds of approximately 120 degrees. And also that these atoms are positioned in plane, in one plane. So this C alpha, the C in the end of the peptide bond, and the C alpha of the next amino acids are all positioned in a planary structure. However, if we take a look at the next amino acid, there are some rotations possible among this axis, among this bond. So we have these different planes, and they can rotate compared to each other. So these rotations are possible, but due to this partially double bond character, all these atoms are positioned in a single plane. Okay, that's an important aspect of these primary structures. We then go to the secondary structure. Secondary structure means local folding of the protein. Local folding of the protein. And this local folding is resulting from the formation of hydrogen bonds that occur between the hydrogen of the amide group and the oxygen of the carbonyl group. So here you see here the formation of hydrogen bonds, and the formation of hydrogen bonds here is the basis of certain secondary structures. If we take a look at different possible secondary structures, then we can have the two most occurring ones. The two most occurring secondary structures are alpha helix and then beta sheets. And this is an example of an alpha helix. So here you can see the peptide chain, and the peptide chain is organized in a right-hand helix system. And this structure is stabilized, this helix structure is stabilized by formation of hydrogen bonds that occur between this amide group and a carbonyl group that is one term above it in the helix system. So here also you have hydrogen bond that is formed, that's coupling two amino acids that are above each other in this helix structure. So this is an alpha helix system. That's a typical secondary structure in proteins. Second, so this is right hand, this is left hand. Yeah, that matters. If you have to write with your right hand or with your left hand, it also matters. If you have a screw, if it's a right hand screw or a left hand screw, if you do this motion, it goes inwards. If it's a left hand screw, it goes outwards. Yeah. Okay, the second important secondary structure is the beta sheet structure, which is presented here. And in the beta sheet structure, you also have these hydrogen bonds between the carbonyl group and the amide group here. Remember from the primary structure that in the peptide bond, all these atoms are in one plane. Means that these atoms are in a single plane. The next amino acid is also in a plane, but there are some rotations possible. So this is how these planary structures can rotate among each other. But here you have one peptide chain, here you have another peptide chain. They are aligned next to each other. So it's not a helix structure. These are two peptides that are aligned next to each other, but they are interacting with each other through the formation of these hydrogen bonds. So this structure is stabilized again by formation of these hydrogen bonds. For the beta sheet structure, you can have two different types of beta sheets. On the one hand side, you have the antiparallel beta sheet, which means that, again, two peptide motifs are aligned next to each other. These hydrogen bonds are formed. However, the orientation of this peptide goes from N-terminal to C-terminal from bottom to top. This goes from N-terminal to C-terminal from top to bottom. So they have the opposite orientation. For that reason, it's called an antiparallel beta sheet structure. If you compare it with the parallel beta sheet structure, that's indicated here. Again, you have these two peptides that are aligned next to each other. This interaction is stabilized by formation of hydrogen bonds, but in this case, both peptides are positioned in the same orientation. So both from N-terminal to C-terminal, from bottom to top. How is this possible? You have a long amino acid chain, and that can have structures like this. So you have an intermediate loop, and then these two are aligned next to each other in the same orientation.
Are those considered as one long peptide?
This is one long peptide chain. Also, this is one long peptide chain. So these secondary structures are typically formed in a single long peptide chain. Okay? So alpha helix, beta sheets are the two most frequent secondary structures that occur in protein structures. However, there are some alternatives as well. So here, for instance, you have the 310 helix. And in the 310 helix, it's also a helix structure, like it is with the alpha helix. So the alpha helix again here has a structure like this. And in the alpha helix, you have around 3.6 amino acids per turn. You don't have to know that by heart. But if you compare it with the 310 helix, that's more condensed. So there you have 3 amino acids per turn. And if you take a look at the top of such an alpha helix, you have it looks like this. So this is a top view of an alpha helix. With this, the inside of the helix. And then at the outside, you have different R groups that are protruding. In this case, you have a 310 helix, the top view, and here we have these amino acid side chains that are sticking out of this helix-like structure. Okay. Then you also have a P helix and so on. That's not too important, but if you know how an alpha helix and a beta sheet structure is formed, that's more than sufficient. Then we go to the tertiary structure. Tertiary structure is the global folding of protein. And a global folding of the protein, it means that in your peptide chain, your long peptide chain, you can have some alpha helix structures, you can have some beta sheet structures, and this is all folded in a certain 3D structure, a global 3D structure. And it's indicated here. So you have a long peptide chain where you can recognize some secondary structure. For instance, here an anti-parallel beta sheet, here an alpha helix structure, but all these secondary structures are folded in their way into a global 3D structure. So that's the tertiary structure of the protein. Which interactions form the basis of this folding? They are indicated here. So first of all, you have an interaction, and I have to say, the interactions here involve interactions between the side chains. That's why I emphasized on the importance of these side chains, because they have a big influence on the global folding of the protein. Here you can see how these side chains can contribute to folding. Here is your long peptide chain with the amino acid side chains that are shown here. And due to the interaction between these amino acid side chains, you can have some bending of the final protein structure. Which interactions can occur? First of all, you have the hydrophobic interactions. Hydrophobic interactions are van der Waals forces that occur between hydrophobic R groups. Here, for instance, 2 valine amino acids that can interact with these van der Waals forces. Second is the interaction between 2 different amino acid side chains by formation of a hydrogen bond, as it is indicated here. And then the next one is an ion bond. An ion bond is an electrostatic attraction between a positively charged amino acid side chain and a negatively charged amino acid side chain. So here, for instance, the side chain of lysine and side chain of glutamate or aspartate. And these interactions between the side chains will contribute to the final folding of your protein. These interactions here are also ordered in increasing strength. So van der Waals is the weakest force, the ion bonds are the largest force, and then there is a fourth one, the formation of real covalent bonds, which is indicated here. And that's typically by the formation of a disulfide bridge. I will give a bit more detail in the next slide. But this is a disulfide bridge where you have a proper covalent bond. Of course, this is also more strong than ion bonds. Ion bonds are reversible. Covalent bonds are usually irreversible. However, these covalent bonds that are formed are not contributing to folding, but once the protein has folded, it can contribute to the rigidity of the protein structure. So here, a bit more about these disulfide bonds. how can they be formed? By an oxidation of two cysteine amino acid side chains. So here we have an amino acid with a cysteine side chain that has a thiol group in the side chain. And here, at the other part of the peptide chain, you have another amino acid, cysteine. If an oxidation reaction occurs, then a disulfide bond will be formed, giving rise to a covalent link. And this is also what you can see here, this long peptide structure. This has a certain folding. And if two cysteine residues are located next to each other, and if you have an oxidizing environment, then these disulfide bonds will be formed. Here as well, and there as well. This doesn't affect the initial folding of the protein, but once folded in this way, the covalent bonds that are formed can contribute to the rigidity of the structure. Sorry? This orange line indicates the linear polymer, so that refers to the primary structure. If you would see some curling, for instance, then the orange line will still be the primary structure, but this curling will indicate an alpha helix, referring to a secondary structure. These disulfide bonds can be formed between two amino acid side chains. The amino acid is cysteine, and it doesn't matter if the cysteine is in a certain secondary structure or not. Yes? So why is this structure important? This is an example of a protein, the green fluorescent protein, and these blocked arrows, they present beta sheet structures. So here you can see a blocked arrow pointing upwards, here one downwards. So the interaction between these two is an anti-parallel beta sheet. But this is a bit more complex than that, because here you have different beta sheets that are organized in a barrel-like structure. So all these beta sheets form the outside of a barrel. For that reason, it's also called a beta barrel structure. And if you take a top view of this protein, so this is a side view, if you take a top view of this protein, then it will look like this. While this is the shape of the barrel, but this is inside the barrel. Okay? So why is this important? Green fluorescent protein is a protein that's produced by a certain jellyfish. And it gives you a green glow when you watch them in the sea. And this green fluorescent protein, it is built up like this. So it consists of certain beta sheets, a definitely specific 3D structure, definitely specific tertiary structure. And the fluorescent group in this protein is actually within an alpha helix, which is indicated here, and this alpha helix is actually protected within this barrel. And the fact that this alpha helix is protected within the barrel, it means that this fluorescent group is protected a bit from harsh conditions in the environment. And this typical structure, so the alpha helix locked inside this barrel, results in the fact that this fluorescent molecule still has its activity, still has its fluorescence in a wide range of pH, in a wide range of temperatures, and so on. So because it's protected within this beta barrel. So there's, again, a direct link between the structure of this protein and the properties of this protein. And GFP, why do I use this example? Because it's a protein that's very widely used in research. So it's very convenient to... do you have a question?
No.
No? I thought you had a question. Sorry, I have to disturb you. So you can label different organisms with such a fluorescent protein. You can label bacteria to monitor their behavior in the environment, but you can also genetically modify animals to produce this fluorescent protein. For instance, glowfish are commercially available. I think it might look very fancy when you have an aquarium filled with fluorescent fish. but you can also pose some ethical questions regarding this application. But also in the research, this green fluorescent protein is very widely used, so also in animal research and so on. And then we come to the quaternary structure. Quaternary structure is the last level, and it's actually an association of different proteins to each other. So, and these proteins are then called subunits. And that's presented here. So this is an example. It's hemoglobin, and hemoglobin consists of 4 proteins, and these 4 proteins are associated to each other to form one functional unit. So 4 subunits form one functional hemoglobin unit. And in this case, how are these subunits attached to each other? Also by interaction between the side chains of the amino acid of one subunit with side chains of amino acids of another subunit. And in this case, the association of these 4 subunits is important to make the proper function. And again, the function here is transporting oxygen from the lungs to the rest of the tissues. So people that are interested in the exact mechanism of this hemoglobin, they can ask me afterwards, but it's quite interesting. What is the thing that binds oxygen for hemoglobin? That's indicated here in the middle of these subunits. These are heme groups, and the heme groups will bind the oxygen, and then this protein will transport oxygen to the rest of the tissues where it's needed. Okay, so that's about the 4 structural levels of a protein. But then, in some cases, to have a certain function, the protein needs additional molecules. These are called cofactors. And a cofactor is actually the non-protein part that also associates with the protein. And the cofactor is usually essential for the function of the protein. And we can make a distinction between inorganic cofactors and organic cofactors. Organic cofactors are very often certain vitamins, or certain vitamins are often precursors of essential cofactors. And indeed, they are required for the biological activity. So just to name a few examples, I already named one. This heme group is an example of a cofactor. So this is an essential part, but it's a non-protein part. And the chemical structure of such a heme group is indicated here. And it's actually the iron that is bound by oxygen, or oxygen that's bound by iron here. So these heme groups are really needed for oxygen transport. Another example here is zinc. Zinc is an example of an inorganic cofactor. And in some cases, here you have the green line indicating the peptide chain. You have here some amino acid side chains. But here, a zinc ion is absolutely necessary for the activity of this enzyme. And in this case, it's an alcohol dehydrogenase. Alcohol dehydrogenase is the enzyme that converts ethanol to acetaldehyde when you went to the pub and drink too much beer. And it's the acetaldehyde that gives you the toxic effects. So that's this enzyme that's responsible. And in this case, zinc ions are important for the activity of that enzyme. So protein structure is essential for function, that's clear. And this is an overview of the 4 levels of protein structure, going from the primary structure, secondary structure. In this example, the alpha helix is shown. Here we have the tertiary structure. This is one hemoglobin subunit which consists all of alpha helixes that are attached to each other. And then 4 of these subunits will associate to make one quaternary structure and one functional protein complex. For the difference between secondary and tertiary structure, I usually refer to these springs. You have these springs, but these springs have a certain secondary structure, this helix-like structure, but that spring can also be bound in several ways, like you see here. And that folding of the spring, you still have the secondary structure within the spring, but it has a certain 3D structure, which is referred to as a tertiary structure. Yeah. So the basis is the interaction between the side chains of one subunit. One is the amino acids. For instance, here, if you take this blue subunit and the orange-like subunit here, they are coupled to each other by interactions that occur between amino acids of this blue chain with amino acids of the orange-like chain. And the interactions also occur between the side chains of amino acids in a similar way as we showed with the tertiary structures. So that can be hydrogen bonds, it can be ion bonds. Okay, yeah. Yeah, very good question. So the question is, can we predict the structure based on the order of amino acids? That's actually a research domain that's considerably increased interest the last 5 years, and we can do some predictions. It's not foolproof yet because it requires a lot of computing power. What such a simulation tool does is calculate all different interactions that are possible and look for the most stable composition. However, you have to take into account that that's more than 10 to the 50 possible interactions are possible. So it takes a lot of computing power. But there is a tool, AlphaFold, for instance, that's more and more performant in predicting these tertiary structures. Okay, the counterpart of folding is denaturation. So denaturation means that the weak interactions within the protein structure are destroyed. So this means that the secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structures are destroyed, but not the primary structure. The primary structure will remain because the primary structure is based on a covalent bond between the carboxylic acid group of one amino acid with the amino group of the other amino acid. So that's a covalent bond, and that's too strong to destroy. However, the other structural levels can be destroyed because there are weak interactions, hydrogen bonds, hydrophobic interactions, and so on. These are weak interactions, so much more easy to destroy these levels of structure. But it's important, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structure are destroyed, but not the primary structure. And this is how it's visualized. So here we have certain proteins. Typically, in this case, it's an alpha helix folded protein. When we, for instance, apply heat, the hydrogen bonds that stabilize this helix, indicated in red here, these hydrogen bonds are destroyed. And then this alpha helix structure will be destroyed as well. And here you have your denatured proteins. However, you can clearly see that this peptide chain remains. So the primary structure is still intact, but the secondary structure, the tertiary structure is removed. What can happen next? Often there are some interactions possible, for instance, between this part of this peptide and this part of this peptide. And in that case, these proteins start to coagulate. They start to coagulate, forming a large 3D network of all these peptide chains. And usually they also precipitate and become solids. Okay. What's also important, after denaturation, the protein structure is lost, but also the function of the protein is lost. Again, protein structure and function are often linked to each other. So when the structure is lost, also the function is lost. Some examples. Baking of an egg. Baking of an egg is typically an example of protein denaturation. The proteins in your egg white, if you take your egg white, it's more or less translucent and it's fluid, right? If you put it in the pan and you increase the temperature, then at first, what you can see here, this is your globular structure. So these are the folded proteins of albumin proteins in this case. And then first, increasing the temperature, the tertiary structure and the secondary structures are removed giving rise to these long linear peptide chains. In this case, indicated in red are cysteine amino acid side chains. And remember, these cysteine amino acid side chains, they can form disulfide bonds. And when these linear peptide chains are aligned more or less next to each other, and you increase the heat, you will form disulfide bonds between different protein chains. And that makes that not only your egg white will turn opaque, it will not be translucent again, but it will also solidify. And solidification is resulting from this cross-linking between the different denatured albumin proteins. Okay? So, increasing the heat, it's definitely one example of how proteins can be denatured, but there are some other measures that you can do to denature proteins. One measure that you can take is to apply a drastic pH change. And that occurs, for instance, in cheese production. In cheese production, the proteins in your milk will be denatured, and at the end they will coagulate and form a solid mass that is further ripened into a cheese product. Any idea how a pH change can contribute to protein denaturation? Yeah, that's more or less the case. Remember again your acidic and your basic amino acid side chains. The basic amino acid side chains are positively charged. The negative, the acidic amino acid side chains are negatively charged. Good interaction, electrostatic interaction. However, as we saw with the charges of these amino acids, for instance, if we decrease the pH considerably, which we do in cheese production, then the negative charge on the acidic amino acids will disappear. So you have a positive charge, but no net negative charge anymore. So the interaction is lost. And if you do that with a lot of amino acids, then your secondary and your tertiary structure will fall down. Is that clear? Okay. So that's another way of denaturing. Another way is applying detergents or polar or organic solvents, apolar solvents. It's with the same principle, but adding detergents or organic solvents interacts more with the van der Waals interactions. And also it disrupts these van der Waals interactions. Also again, these van der Waals interactions are important for the 3D structure. If these are lost, then also 3D structure can be lost. Heavy metals can also interfere with ion bonds. Again, disrupting the interaction between amino acid side chains. And for that reason, when in kitchens, when you want to have, how do you say it, the egg white, when you stir it a lot, it also becomes a solid mass, you know. So that's also denaturation. And usually the chefs did this in copper recipients because it also contains some heavy metals, improving the denaturation because this egg white is also denatured egg white.
Because of the complex ion which also interacts with charges.
Yeah. For instance, copper ions will also be bound to negatively charged side chains, and that will disrupt the attraction between this negative side chain and the positive side chain. And that's what you meant, I think, yeah? Okay, so heavy metals can also contribute to denaturation, and also mechanical stress. That's whipping your egg white. Whipping your egg white into a solid mass. Whipping is causing mechanical stress that also disrupts these weak interactions. And again, contributes to denaturation of the egg white. Then, other examples of why and when denaturation of proteins can be important. A bit distracted, but okay, denaturation of keratin. I mentioned keratin is an important protein in our hair, also in the nails, but also in the hair. How is this alpha keratin built? It consists of a long linear alpha helix, which is indicated in green, and on the top you have a sphere-like shape, a globular domain. So a large sphere-like shape, and then one long alpha helix. Two of these alpha helixes can associate with each other to form the quaternary structure. And that's indicated here. So they intertwine with each other to form a so-called coiled coil. Okay? In the next step, these coiled coils are also interacting with each other. So they're aligned to make a certain fiber. So this also indicates that it has some structural function. And these different coiled coils are cross-reacted with disulfide bonds to make them more rigid. If we take a look at the keratin in the nails, there it's a more rigid structure. There we have more disulfide bonds between these different coiled coils. If you compare it with hair, you have a lower amount of disulfide bonds, which allows some flexibility with which these coiled coils can move a little bit among each other. Okay? So the disulfide bonds and the quaternary structure here also explains the properties of keratin in nails and in hair. So how can we make use of this? So when we go to the hairdresser, we ask the hairdresser, okay, can you put some curly hairs on my head? Without using a wig, of course, but you know what I mean. But that they form these curly hairs. What they do typically is use. So here you can see these coiled coils that are cross-linked with each other with disulfide bonds. In the first step, they apply a reducing agent. A reducing agent to break down the disulfide bonds. The disulfide bonds are then broken down, and you have a bit more flexibility between these keratin coiled coils. Then the hair is positioned in the shape you want, usually making use of these thingies here. And then we use an oxidizing agent again. And when the hairs are used in a certain shape, they're placed in a certain shape, and then they're oxidized again, making the formation of these disulfide bonds possible again. And then it will remain in that shape. Okay? So this is how folding, denaturation also can be important at the hairdresser. Okay. I will briefly skip this one. I will regard this as self-study. It's more of the same, so how protein is folded and how it contributes to a certain function. I think I am tired. I think also you're tired. So I think we can pick this up next week. Is he applause because I stopped 5 minutes earlier?
Bro, I know you were